Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. I'm Pascal Lotin, and I'm joined today by Dr. Mattias Desmet, a professor of clinical psychology at Ghent University in Belgium, a practicing psychotherapist, and one of the world's leading scholars on the theory of mass formation, as well as the author of the wonderful book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Mattias, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Pascal.
It's great having you. You are one of the voices that was very, very important during the COVID-19 mass formation. You were the person who championed that kind of interpretation, and you wrote this very important book of trying to make sense psychologically of some of the tendencies that we've been seeing going on in society. Can we maybe talk a little bit about this? Can we start with the concept of mass formation and how it links up with totalitarianism?
Yes, yes, that's a good point to start. Um, well, I started doing a PhD at Ghent University in Belgium back in 2003, and I was supposed to do a classical research in psychology, uh, where I would investigate the associations between certain personality traits and depressive symptoms. It might seem like a strange point to start uh, going into the topic of totalitarianism, but you will see it is related. It's like it's So I started to doing classical research in psychology, and like after a few months, I had a feeling that like these research methods that I was supposed to use, like where I would measure uh, the psychological characteristics and then compute statistical correlations between them, that these research methods actually uh, uh, impossibly could lead to valid results. And because when I measured the same psychological characteristic, for instance, a personality trait, in three different ways, the results were often completely different. And I I uh, I asked my promoter of my PhD whether, rather than doing this classical research in psychology, whether um, I could just uh, investigate the validity of research methods in psychology. And I was granted permission to do so. And then, like when I was investigating these research methods in psychology, like after 2 years, the replication crisis started in the sciences, which actually showed that like the vast majority of the published research papers are false. And there was this famous paper, of course, by John Ioannidis, which was titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." So this problem I stumbled upon in psychology turned out to be quite widespread in the sciences. Like more than 85% of the papers cannot be reproduced, which means that they actually have no scientific validity at all. And the strange thing was, like, on the basis of the results of my PhD, I published my first book, a very small book. I don't have a copy with me here now, but it's a very small book, uh, which was titled "The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology," and I made it clear, I think, in a very clear way, in such a way that, well, like even a child maybe could understand when it sees certain examples that the research method in psychology cannot possibly lead to valid conclusions. And the strange thing was at that moment that every time when I gave a presentation or a lecture about this phenomenon, where I really presented the audience with these very simple examples showing that, for instance, the measurement methods in psychology are not reliable and are not valid, and that they contain too much measurement error to do meaningful statistical inference. And like every time I presented this, I could see the same thing. Like a few people in the audience, like maybe a few percent, like 2-3% of the people, were very enthusiastic and they wanted to know more. But like more than 90%, or at least many of them, got angry with me. And when I asked them, like, okay, but tell me, what, why would I be wrong? Can you show? I have a master. I have a PhD in psychology, but also a master degree in statistics. So I'm a statistician as well. And every time I ask them, like, show me, where is my statistical mistake? Where is the mathematical mistake in my line of reasoning? Like nobody ever gave me an answer because I think it was clear that from a mathematical point of view, I was right. And at that moment, I just started to become fascinated by something very strange, like that. Under certain conditions, very intelligent people, because like my colleagues at university are very intelligent people, they are highly intelligent people, but under certain conditions, highly intelligent people can buy into a narrative that is actually absurd. And no matter what you do, they will refuse to drop the narrative. They will continue to buy into it. So, and like somewhere, I think it was around 2013 or something, I started to go into mass psychology because I started to become aware of the fact that this strange expert blindness, as I sometimes call it, this strange expert blindness, this strange blindness of people under certain conditions, like cannot be explained on the basis of individual psychology alone. You need to understand how people and people's identity, people's cognitive functioning is in the grip of psychological processes at the level of the group to which they belong. That's where I got interested. And after a few years, maybe, I started to become aware that. So I started to read about mass psychology, and after a while, after a few years, I started to become aware of the fact that actually this phenomenon for which I coined the term mass formation. The term was used by Gustave Le Bon as well, sometimes, a few times, and Sigmund Freud as well, I think, used it a few times. But then I use it as the major term to indicate the strange phenomenon of group formation, which has this very strange effects at the level of individual psychological functioning. So like mass formation, when people are in the grip of a mass formation, they will typically be incapable of taking a critical distance of everything the group believes in. And when the group believes in the most absurd things, the people will buy into it, no matter how intelligent they are. They will become willing to radically self-sacrifice. That's another very strange characteristic of mass formation. People in the grip of a mass formation are willing to radically self-sacrifice. And then the most dangerous thing, of course, is that they will typically become radically intolerant for dissonant voices, for everyone who thinks differently. And like this strange phenomenon, I started to become aware of the fact that actually this phenomenon of mass formation is the basis of totalitarianism. Like that's the phenomenon of mass formation is what makes totalitarian states such as Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, which are of course the most famous examples. So this phenomenon of mass formation is what makes totalitarian states completely different from classical dictatorships. And most people mix up the two. Most people think like that Nazi Germany was a dictatorship. Not at all. And or that the Soviet Union was a classical dictatorship. That's not true at all. It's completely different. And then the difference is that in a totalitarian state at the psychological level is based on a mass formation, and a classical dictatorship isn't.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. So you're viewing then the totalitarian state as something that goes psychologically much, much deeper than just the power structures, right? Of the political power structures that are built. They essentially include this fanatic belief by a large number of the group into the core tenets of the group. That's about it, right? And it's not just that the guy on the top has all the weapons and then is able to coerce everybody into submission.
No, exactly. That would be a classical dictatorship. Like in a classical dictatorship, there is this dictatorial regime, which indeed, as you said, like has all the weapons, and people are scared of the aggressive potential of the regime, and so they just accept that the dictatorial regime unilaterally imposes its social contract to them. That's a classical dictatorship. But a totalitarian state, it is something much, 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 much more powerful at the psychological level. In a totalitarian state, starts usually in the population. That means that a part of the population starts to believe fanatically in a certain ideology. For instance, the race theories, which were popular before the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany, or historical materialism, Marxism, which became very popular in the Soviet in Russia by the end of the 19th century. So first, the beginning of a totalitarian state is a psychological process, where a certain part of the population, usually not much more than 20 to 30%, so it's not everyone, definitely not. So like 20 to 30% of the population starts to believe fanatically in a certain ideology, and because of the emotional function this ideology has in this part of the population, a mass formation will emerge, where people so fanatically believe in the ideology that they are incapable of seeing everything in reality which is in contrast or in conflict with that ideology, and where they start to believe so fanatically in it that they are willing to sacrifice their lives for it, and where they start to feel very aggressive against everyone who doesn't buy into the ideology. So that's what's happening in a totalitarian state. And once this process of mass formation emerges in society, there is a chance that there are certain rhetorically gifted people who use it to seize control of the state apparatus. So they present themselves, as Hitler did, as Lenin did. They present themselves as those who incarnate like all the virtues of this ideology, and they use the masses to seize control, and then like a state system emerges, which, as Hannah Arendt very eloquently said in her Origins of Totalitarianism, she said like a state system emerges in that case, which has a huge secret police, namely this part of the population which blindly, fanatically buys into the state ideology, and who are willing to report everyone to the state who doesn't buy fanatically into this ideology. So that's what happens. Like 20 to 30% of the people buy fanatically believes in the ideology, and they are willing to report their fathers, their mothers, their children, everyone to the state who doesn't follow the narrative. So that means that almost in every sleeping room, every kitchen, every house, there is someone who actually will report everyone of their family members to the state if they are not loyal enough to the state narrative. That's what happened in Iran, for instance, in the 1978 revolution, for instance. I know a woman who lived there, and she witnessed. She was the daughter of a mayor of one of the major cities of Iran, and she witnessed how a mother who reported her son to the state put the noose around his neck when he was on the scaffold, and when he was dead, she was very proud to accept a medal for heroinship. So that was back in 1978. But there's so many examples, like of, in every process of mass formation, people after a while, very strange, like in Eastern Europe after the Second World War, 20 to 30% of the people belong to the secret police. Literally, they joined the secret police. And when after the collapse of Eastern Germany, when people went to the archives and tried to find out who reported them to the state, almost everyone was reported by a family member. Yeah. So that's what happens, and that's what makes a totalitarian state so extremely suffocating and powerful at a psychological level, and that's why it is so extremely important to understand what happens at the psychological level in a mass formation. And I'll add one more thing to it, if I may. You know, from the moment I started to investigate the phenomenon of totalitarianism, I had two questions, like what makes it different from a classical dictatorship? And the second question was like, why did totalitarianism emerge for the first time in the 20th century? Because before the 20th century, there were no totalitarian states. And the answer to both questions, after a while I found out, was just that the phenomenon of mass formation. Like, it's mass formation which makes totalitarianism different from classical dictatorships. And the reason why totalitarian states emerged for the first time in the 20th century is that the phenomenon of mass formation, for certain reasons, which I go into in my book, for certain reasons, the phenomenon of mass formation has always existed. It has always existed. But it became stronger throughout the last centuries. It became stronger and stronger and stronger, just as a consequence of another process, namely the fact that society is atomizing. It's falling apart. More and more people feel lonely, isolated. And that's why mass formations become stronger. As men, we see it now, like, for instance, the way in which what happens at the geopolitical level now, like, so many people just buy into all these narratives which are used now to go to war, while everyone who would like think for one moment seriously could see that most of these narratives, well, I won't say that they are complete lies, but a lot of it is inaccurate and more propaganda than truth.
This is my main concern, This is why I think your theory is so absolutely important in order to understand what's happening to Europe at the moment. Because the question we need to answer is, how is it that so many very intelligent people, extremely intelligent people, and people who are in the same circles as we are, buy into the war narratives? Why is Europe marching toward a war with Russia? And it is utterly clear, especially if you're looking what's happening in Germany, how the Europeans are gearing up. They're saying so. They're not even hiding it, for a war with Russia, which is it's a suicidal endeavor. And we've seen before. I mean, you were one of the main critics, of course, of the way that that COVID was approached with measures that were really like extremely harmful and so on. And I mean, the mass formation issue then tries, if I understand it correctly, you're trying to understand how on the level of the group, how the level of the group interacts with the individual psychology of each person, right? And how certain things then start overriding even rational thinking. So one more question here, like, is it also the availability of the medium, the fact that for the first time in the 20th century we have mass media, right? We have TV and radio, and this ability of large groups to hear the same narratives at the same time, and that apart from the atomization of society, that you have suddenly possibilities of talking to millions or tens of millions of people. Does that flow into it as well? And where do you think that the current state then is with the ability of on social media of a whole new level of mass communication?
Yes. Let me first go into for 1 minute into something you said in the beginning, namely that you could see how highly intelligent people just buy into the war narratives in Europe. Exactly, exactly. And the strangest thing is that, or one of the very remarkable things in the phenomenon of mass formation is that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people become for mass formation. So this is a very strange thing. You would think that highly educated people would be resilient, that they have this skilled critical thinking ability, which is not true. Like Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century already wrote in his book, The Psychology of the Masses, of the crowd, the psychology of the crowd. He said, like, the higher the level of education, the more people will fall prey to mass formation. Something that was echoed by Jacques Ellul in his book Propaganda, the best book about propaganda that has ever been written, I think. He said exactly the same. He said, the longer people go to school, the more easily they will fall prey for propaganda. So just because he said, like Jacques Ellul said that this had to do with the fact that education and our school system actually is a kind of indoctrination
Mm.
unconsciously. That's not that teachers know consciously that they are indoctrinating children. No, it's just their the educational system learns people not to think for themselves. It learns them to think all in the same way, which means it learns them to think according to the mainstream view on man and the world. And in this way, education becomes a psychological preparation, um, um, which makes people vulnerable for the propaganda that will be used later on in their lives. So that's one thing. So the higher the level of education, more easily they fall prey to it. And you can see it indeed in the example of the war in Ukraine. The war with Russia is an excellent example. I wrote 2 articles about it. I published them on my Substack page. One article where I go into uh, uh, the structure of Putin's Russia, which exactly Putin is not a saint. We know that. We know he's not a saint. And there are many problems in Russia, also at the level of free speech. But if you look from the other perspective, like what NATO did, then one thing for sure, NATO is also not a saint, and they have this expansionist politics, in which actually goes so far that I think, in my humble opinion, that there is no other choice for Putin and Russia than to go to war. Because if they don't, they will lose their they won't be a superpower anymore. So and at the I it's so strange, like that an entire population really believes that Putin is this devil which has to be destroyed, or which threatens to destroy Europe, without ever being able to take the other perspective, and to see what happened in Ukraine, to see how American companies purchased like 30% of all the on 30% of the country, and so on and so on. It was a so that's what mass formation does.
And no number of counter arguments will ever help. The first person I interviewed on my channel 4 years ago was Jack Matlock, the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union. And he kept saying, like, this is our mistake. We should never have done that. And he's like just one in a long line of people who said, like, we must not push this war on the Russians. It was pushed and it became a war. And it has been a war for 4 years. And even though all of these revelations came out, including the way in which the CIA had been infiltrating, according to this New York Times, not some conspiracy theorist magazine, the New York Times, how the CIA after 2014 had been infiltrating Ukraine and been starting to build up Ukraine as a bastion against the Russians and forward capabilities. How it was the UK and the United States that sabotaged the Istanbul Agreement. All of this is out, confirmed from several sides. Yet, if you bring it up, the people who are under the grip of mass formation, they will get angry. Can you explain to me why it is that anger is the reaction that is then that the individual produces instead of a rational conversation?
Yes, that's I exactly. That's why it's so important, I think, to understand what happens in a mass formation at the emotional level. There's something very interesting, and I will just first take a helicopter view, zoom out a little bit, like somewhere in the, let's say, 17th century or something. We like there was a huge, what I call, metaphysical revolution. Before the 17th century, the dominant view on men and the world was the religious worldview. And then, like in the 17th century, that changed. The religious worldview was replaced by slowly, step by step, by a rationalist, materialist worldview, which started to believe that the real world is the world you can see with your eyes and understand with your brain. And from then on, well, that I think that's what you have to understand. Like from then on, we started to believe that the human being, in the first place, is a rational being. And also that we should be rational beings. Like that, when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you should wonder about is like, how will I be as smart as possible today? That's what the rationalist worldview believes. It's no longer, like when people before the 17th century woke up, they used to think, or at least that was what they were expected to do by the dominant worldview, like, how can I live a good life today? So good and bad were the most important things. The first question you should ask was an ethical question, not a rational question. And so, like, from the 17th century onwards, we started to believe that the human being should live its life, starting from the question, like, how can we be as smart as possible? How can we live a life that is as rational as possible? And it um, uh, the major goal of life in this respect is to be the smartest and the strongest in the struggle to survive, something like that. And the strange thing was, like, if you look at modern democracy, how it started somewhere back in the 18th century, when after the American Revolution, you could say that the founding fathers, for instance, of American democracy, they all really believed that the human being is a rational being. They believed that people, when they were free, would think rationally and choose for politicians who were, from a rational point of view, the best leaders. That was people like Thomas Jefferson and stuff. If you read their works, they all believe that. They believe, like, and even all the Enlightenment thinkers really believe that the human being is a rational being. Now, strange thing was, like, after a few decades, like, I think by the beginning of the 19th century, 1810 or something, like 20 years later, after the American Revolution, or 30 years after the American Revolution, all the founding fathers of modern democracy they knew already that they made a fatal mistake. That they knew already that the human being is not a rational being, not at all. And that was the begin, like almost at the same time, the phenomenon of modern propaganda emerged. Modern propaganda, which means a kind of practice. Like, propaganda is the most important organizing principle of modern democracy. If you read the work of the beginning of democracy, if you read all these people uh, who witnessed the problems of early democracy, they all said we have no other option than manipulating the population. If you read, there is no other option. Without manipulation, it's impossible to organize society. And because by that time, after 20 or 30 years, they knew already that citizens and the people, that they absolutely wouldn't behave rationally. So modern propaganda is like the return of something that was repressed in the beginning of modern democracy. Modern democracy started from the belief that the human being is a rational being,
Mm.
and propaganda starts from exactly the opposite. You can make people believe the most irrational things, no matter what, when you just confront them time and time again with irrational, emotional messages. So that's the point. You have these two things. On the one hand, the belief, so typical for Enlightenment culture, that human beings are rational beings, and then, on the other hand, exactly the opposite. Like human beings are completely irrational, and with propaganda, which always goes to the emotions of people, which manipulates the emotions with propaganda, you can make them believe everything you want. So that's the point. Modern democracy actually is essentially is exactly the opposite of what it pretends to be. It pretends to be a system where people are free and can choose rationally for what is good for them, but essentially, everyone who really studies modern democracy in an open minded way will conclude that it is a system where people are fooled every day by propaganda, and where the population starts to believe the most absurd and irrational things because pro- propaganda manipulates them.
Or they can start believing the most absurd of things, right? It's not necessary that they do, but it is possible, which is why the question, oh, how do democracies produce totalitarian states, is kind of the wrong question. It's more like, how is it that some democratic systems do not fall prey to totalitarianism and mass formation, whereas others do? um what 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 is it that is so what is it that then informs this mass formation phenomenon, though, that sometimes they you have this movement, and I don't recall if it was a metaphor that came to mind when I was listening to one of your podcasts, or in somebody else, when how do you have this the physical phenomenon that if you're on a bridge that is wobbly and a lot of people walk over that thing, then people naturally have to start walking in lockstep because they try to counteract the swinging of the bridge, and that itself then makes the swinging of the bridge worse, to the point where a bridge can collapse, that starts wobbling, right? And is mass formation, in a sense, that kind of phenomenon where each individual is kind of forced to react to the movements of the other one, and that then causes lockstep and in the end a totalitarian state?
To a certain extent, it is. You know, maybe it would be good to go into the 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 mechanism of mass formation. Like in a few minutes, we can walk through it. Like I think, in my opinion, like I think like one of the major questions when you're studying the phenomenon of mass psychology or mass formation, one of the major questions always is like, why did it get stronger? Like, okay, there were always mass formations. Like there was the Crusades, there was the witch hunts in the 17th century, and so on and so on. There was always mass formations, but the strange thing is like that this phenomenon became stronger and stronger and stronger throughout the last few centuries. And I believe that the reason why it became stronger in the first place was that the level of loneliness emerged. Like I, st- I studied phenomenon of mass formation for a few years, and in my opinion, the starting point is always loneliness. So many scholars or have remarked that like something like propaganda cannot work in a population with good social bonds. Like you need disconnected, lonely people for propaganda to be very efficacious. So that what happened in the first place was this: like our rationalist, materialist fuel men in the world, for many reasons, I describe them in my book, disconnected people. It made them feel lonely, and it made more and more people feel lonely. And that's the first step. That's the first very important step at the psychological level. Loneliness. Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel, was the first who used the term atomization to, in the beginning of the 19th century already, to refer to the fact that in modern societies, more and more people started to feel lonely. And then, like, if you look like now in the 20th century, 21st century, like, I think it's up to 40 to 60% of the people who report to feel lonely. Like Theresa May in Great Britain appointed the Minister of Loneliness just because she acknowledged how much lonely people they were. And like in the States, the US Surgeon General in 2017, I think, said that there was a loneliness epidemic. So many people feel lonely, disconnected. That's the first step. And then once people feel lonely, they will typically start to struggle with lack of meaning making. An isolated human being. To an isolated human being, it always seems that life is without purpose, without meaning, just because human beings have a spontaneous feeling of purpose and meaning in life when they feel that their existence has an effect on other human beings. So lonely people don't have that anymore, and they will typically be confronted with lack of meaning making. Like, it's unbelievable. Like uh, almost 50% of the world population believes that his or her job is without purpose, and it is a so-called bullshit job. So it's the percentages are staggering. And then something extremely important happens at the emotional level. Once people feel lonely, disconnected, isolated, and struggle with lack of meaning making, something very typical will happen at the emotional, at the affective level. And that's what, in my theory, is just quintessential to understand mass formation. Like, once people feel isolated, struggle with lack of meaning making, they will be confronted at the emotional level with what I called free-floating frustration, aggression, and anxiety. That means a kind of frustration, aggression, and anxiety, which people cannot connect to an object. So they, meaning in plain words, that they feel frustrated, aggressive, and anxious without knowing what they feel frustrated, aggressive, and anxious for. And that's an extremely
Mhm.
painful state. It's extremely like when you feel anxious, but you think that you know why you feel anxious, you feel a little bit in control. If you feel anxious of a dog, you know you can run from the dog. But if you feel anxious without knowing what you feel anxious for, at psychological level, it's an extremely painful mental state. And when many people are in this state, which was definitely the case, for instance, before the corona crisis, when many people in a population are in this state, when there are very high levels of free-floating anxiety, something very typical might happen. If under these conditions, someone distributes a narrative through the mass through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, for instance, a virus, and at the same time providing a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, for instance, the lockdowns,
Yeah.
something very typical might happen. all that free-floating anxiety might at once connect to the object of anxiety, and people might be willing to buy into the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, no matter how absurd it is. Because the reason why they buy into the narrative is not because they believe that it's a rational, effective strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. No, it's just psychologically. It's because the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety functions as a kind of a ritual that allows them to have control over their anxiety. That's the first step. That's the first step. It's like a collective symptom. Something like that happens all the time at the individual level. Like when people have a phobia or one or another compulsive symptom, exactly the same process happens. But in a mass formation, it happens at the collective level. So all these people buy into the narrative because it makes them feel in control again. And then in a second step, something even much more important happens. Because so many people at the same time participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, it makes them feel connected again. They have the feeling that they fight a collective battle with the object of anxiety. It makes them feel connected again. It makes them the strategy, the object of anxiety, the mask wearing, the lockdowns, functions as a collective ritual, which makes them feel united again, which makes them feel as if they can escape the most painful condition a human being can be in, complete isolation. It feels that they can escape their isolation and their loneliness, and that they can form a community again. I see it feels as if, or it seems, because they are not really connected again. That's what makes mass formation so dramatic and so destructive. Because when people form a mass with a mass formation is a kind of group formation which has a very specific characteristic. Like in a healthy group formation, individuals connect to each other. And the group is based on connections between individuals. But in a mass formation, something completely different happens. Like in a mass formation, a mass is a group that emerges not because individuals connect with each other, but because they all connect to the same collective ideal. Meaning that after a while, like uh, all the energy, all the love between people is sucked away, and it's all injected in the bond between the individual and the collective, meaning that after a while, people love the collective ideal as it is usually incarnated in one or another leader, like Stalin or Hitler, for instance. People love the collective ideal much more than other individuals. And that explains, of course, why after a while in a mass formation, mothers start to report their children to the state when they think their children are not loyal enough to the state. So that's what happens in a mass formation. It's an extremely destructive, powerful mechanism where people seem to escape loneliness, where they seem to find a way to take out their frustration, aggression on a scapegoat, where they seem to be in control of their anxiety, but where in reality they feel more and more anxious, frustrated, and aggressive, and feel more and more lonely, and in this way become even more vulnerable to a new mass formation. So that was what happened in when the Corona narrative ended. Immediately, almost day by day, after the Corona narrative lost its grip on society, the Ukraine narrative emerged.
Yeah, Corona was not ended by any kind of lockdown mechanism. Corona was ended by Ukraine, because you could needlessly shift into the next one, and you could even reuse the same kind of jargon. The well, how do we break through that? If And I buy into what you're saying, and I do think you got the analysis of how this works right. What do we do against it? How do we break the grip of mass formation? And on the realistic level and the unrealistic level. I mean, like unrealistically, just like ideally, I've had a talk with Dr. Neil McLaren, who wrote about narcissism and the connection to fascism, and he pitched the idea just on passing, because the system is such that then these narcissists necessarily end up on the top. What we would need is a mechanism to prevent that. So let's say 50% of parliament should be elected, not elected by people, but purely randomly decided. Pure randomness, 50% go to parliament, and then that would be a counter mechanism. That's of course unrealistic, but in the level of such things, and in the realm of realistic things that can be done, what are things that work against this mass formation in which we actually are? And in Europe, we are walking toward a war with Russia if we do not break it.
Yes. Yes, that's the most important question, of course. And like from my analysis, you can very easily say what the solution might be and what the solution won't be, because to understand that, I think we need to go one level deeper, and wonder like what the psychological reasons are for this loneliness that got stronger and stronger. There are 100 reasons why people in modernity during the Enlightenment culture got more and more lonely. There are 100 reasons, but there is one more very fundamental reason, which is the most important one, and which is always forgotten. I know nobody who really focused on what I believe to be the most important, the most fundamental, the root cause of loneliness. The root cause of loneliness, I think, is the fact that in modernity and during the Enlightenment culture, people lost touch with truth. Very strange. Very strange. Like when the Enlightenment tradition started, when the rationalist and materialist view on man and the world started, people started to believe that the entire universe is a kind of a machine, and that the human being is a small machine, a cog in the big machine of the universe, and that the human being is a purely biological being, and that the ultimate goal of life is biological survival, or enjoying as much as possible, or avoiding pain. Doesn't matter, but the ultimate goal of life has to be understood in materialist terms, according to this new materialist worldview. And from there on, something very strange happened. During the Enlightenment culture, humanity believed to have found the royal road, the highway to truth. Like, people started to believe that we can find truth just by observing the world with our eyes, and then determining the exact ratio between all the facts that are observed with our eyes. So that was how we believed to find the truth in Enlightenment culture. And strangely enough, while we believe to be on the highway to truth, in a strange way, we completely lost touch with it. And I believe just because of the following reason. Even antique Greek culture knew already, all the old traditions knew it, that speaking the truth is always dangerous. Because speaking the truth, by definition, means articulating words that destroy illusions. And everyone who tries to find its stability in all kinds of common sense, socially shared illusions and in the world of appearances will get angry when someone speaks the truth. So, everyone could feel that speaking the truth is always risky. And when you really look at life as a game in which the ultimate goal is to be the strongest, to survive, speaking the truth is extremely stupid, just because it puts you at risk. When you really look at the world from a materialist point of view, you have to manipulate other people. And definitely don't try to speak the truth, because truth speech is always dangerous. It's always risky. It makes you weaker in the world of appearances. I can recommend everyone who's watching this podcast to watch the 1978 speech of Alexander Solzhenitsyn at Harvard. Because that's exactly what he's saying there. I watched it for the first time like 1 week ago. That's exactly what he is saying there. He said like, everyone expected Solzhenitsyn to be very critical of communism at Harvard, and of course he was very critical of communism. But at that speech, he was in the first place very critical of Western society. He said Western society lost touch with truth because, he said, they start from a materialist worldview. He almost said literally what I mentioned in my book. And then I never heard a speech before, so I definitely didn't hear it when I wrote my book. But he's along the same lines. He says like, Western culture is lost just because in Western philosophy and in Western materialism, there is no reason whatsoever to be found to speak the truth, because speaking the truth always makes you lose something. So anyway, speaking the truth, when in a society, a materialist society, people lose touch with truth and people find no reason anymore to speak sincerely, something very strange happens. Connection gets lost because speaking the truth is what makes people feel connected. Speaking the truth, you speak the truth when you articulate something that you usually hide behind our narcissistic ideal image. People constantly keep up an ideal image, a narcissistic image, and that's what isolates them from other people. And the act of sincere speech, of truth speech, is what destroys these narcissistic ideal images and connects people again with each other. So a society in which there is less and less free speech is doomed to end in isolation and disconnectedness. Yeah, simply.
One question here, because like the other very typical rationalist thing to assume is, of course, an truth and reality that actually metaphysically exist, and that they are part of an observer independent reality. And this idea of an observer independent reality, to me, is probably one of the most damaging ones. I don't think it is. Even within physics, we've learned that the observer actually is crucial in order to determine the reality of the quantum world. And I view that as well, like as in also within the psychological frameworks of people, right? Truth is observer dependent. That's why, the evilness of Vladimir Putin is an absolute truth within the framework of this group of people. And the relational reality of the Russian political system, where things move each other and then react to things that were imposed externally, that is part of the truth of people maybe like you and I. But it is observer dependent. How do you in your framework account for that, or can it be discounted, the observer question?
Yes, well, the example of quantum mechanics is, of course, a very good example. And I'm writing 2 books at the moment. And one of them goes into the history of science of the last 5 centuries, and of the way in which science actually constantly stumbled upon this strange phenomenon of consciousness, even the strange phenomenon of the soul, but constantly also walked away from it again.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, the some
That's religious. We're gonna go away.
yes, exactly, yes. The seminal scientists, the founding fathers of science, none of them was a materialist. and I even, like, last year, I visited CERN for 1 week because one of the physicists there had read my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, and he was very fond of it. And he said, like, look, maybe you would be happy to be here for a week and to see all these experiments, to observe them, and so I went there. I even once wrote an article, which is also on my Substack, about on the mathematical basis of Bell's theorem. So I really I'm into it, and I was always fascinated by what you mentioned. Of course, that that like even at the level of our material reality, there is an observer effect. Like there is no such thing as an observation which is not influenced or even constructed by the observing entity, by the human being that observes it. So that's true. But I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure that I agree with you when you say that like there is no truth independent of the observer. At least I think you said that. But you know,
Yes.
yes, I believe that I would rather say like reality is always constructed by the observer, and you can see that very easily at the level of elementary particles. Like uh, when before a particle, an elementary particle, is observed, uh, it's a sea of potentialities. It's a wave, probability wave. They say in physics. Of course, they don't know what they say there. Nobody knows what a particle is before it is observed. Like from a physical perspective, okay, it's probably something like a probability wave, which is situated in a Hilbert space in mathematical terms. So. Uh, uh, and at the moment of the observation, suddenly this probability wave collapses, and a particle appears that is located somewhere in space and time, and that has certain physical characteristics, which or like a very small part of all these potentialities, all these characteristics it possessed before the observation. So like the moment we observe, we create reality, a reality which is like one minor aspect of a material reality, which is like one very small part of what uh, everything that constitutes this reality was before the observation. So, but I think that we create reality. There is no reality independent of us as an observer.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, that doesn't mean that there is no truth independent of the observer. Like,
In that case, truth must be shared reality. The realities of different individuals that accept the same reality, and that is then truth. Sorry, we're going into a very abstract.
yeah, no. Yeah, yes, exactly. No, for me, when we are talking about quantum mechanics, truth would be the probability wave, which we don't really know, which is so much more, than we can observe, but but it is out there to a certain extent. It is out there, and at the moment of observation, we reduce truth to this small thing we see with our eyes and understand with our brain. So that's more or less how I think at this moment about it. There is truth, but we can never fully articulate it, know it.
Yeah, it lands us in the problem that truth is actually the cat being dead and alive at the same time. And that's a problem. Which Schrödinger hated that. That's why he did the experiment. But in that case, truth will be reduced to this kind of dissatisfactory state. It's got them both. Which took us very far away from the original question: is can you think of
Yes.
things to do against mass formation? Because we really need to get out of it in Europe, otherwise it's going to be millions of people who will die.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and of course, like the problem started when modernity uh, got alienated from the act of sincere speech, meaning that as a human being, we constantly are confronted with a choice. Like, will we take the easy way and buy into all these narratives that everyone shares? Well, we take the easy way and buy into all these social illusions and shared narratives? Will we just, or will we take a difficult road and say, like, look, okay, this doesn't feel good to me, and I will try to articulate why I feel this isn't right. So the act of sincere speech at all levels, from the lowest to the highest level, always boils down to this. It means that you decide to articulate words that go against certain ideal images that are projected onto us. Like most people even never realize that they buy into all these social norms and ideal images. They just constantly do. They never think for themselves. They always think as others um, want them to think. They speak the words that other people want them to speak, and they never speak their own words. That's what happens in a mass formation. Suddenly, the mass emerges. There is this huge pressure to conform, to go into it. And then there is like a few percentage of the people who decide to say that they do not agree. And Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century already mentioned, he said, like, every time a mass formation emerges, you have three groups. First, 20 to 30% of the people who buy into the mass formation, they just are completely hypnotized, literally hypnotized. It's hypnosis. Mass formation is mass hypnosis. And then you have a large group, 60%, maybe 65%, who knows that there is something wrong, but who chooses to remain silent because they feel the tremendous pressure of the mass formation. And then there is a few percent of the people, sometimes up to 10%, sometimes even 20%, who doesn't go along with it and who decides to speak out, to try to say, like, look, there is something wrong with this narrative here of the Ukraine war, of the Corona crisis, and so on. And Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century already observed, like he said, like, this small group of dissident people, when they speak out, they will almost always be very disappointed because they will feel that the people in the masses refuse to wake up. Because, like, once someone is in a mass formation, is hypnotized, and no matter what you say, no matter how clear your arguments are against the narrative, they will have no psychological impact because they refer to a part of reality to which no emotions are attached anymore. Meaning that at a psychological level, all these arguments have not the least no impact at all. So, and Gustave Le Bon said already, like, okay, so when these dissident people speak out, they were very disappointed because they see that the masses refuse to wake up. But he said, so, and that's crucial. He said, like, but that doesn't mean that their words have no impact. When there are people who continue to speak out in a quiet and sincere way, not claiming that they know everything, but just saying, like, look, I do not agree. There is something wrong according to me. When these people continue to speak out, they will not be able to wake up the masses, but usually they will prevent the masses from going to the last stage of the mass formation, where they typically will try to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with the masses. So, and that's what we need. Right. When the masses do not go to the last stage, they will destroy themselves before they destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. And to the contrary, when the people who do not fall prey to the mass formation choose to remain silent, the masses will first destroy the people who do not go along with the masses, and then they will destroy themselves, as happened in the Soviet Union, for instance. Doesn't matter. We could go give a lot of historical examples.
It's a very good point. So the act of resistance is actually also the act of helping the mass, is actually of preventing the war, just through resistance and through saying, like, no, there's something wrong here. Even if you don't go along with it, I want it to be registered. Okay.
Exactly. You know, the only cure, I could analyze this from 20 perspectives, and you would see it's always the same conclusion. The only cure, the only remedy for a society sick of lies and manipulation, sick of propaganda, is sincerity. That's the only cure. We have to rediscover the psychological value of truth for a human being. Truth is fundamental for a human being. It's fundamental. It's fundamental for every human being, every individual, and it's fundamental for human living together. There can be no society truly humane which is alienated from the act of sincere speech.
I like that one, sincerity, the idea of sincerity, and that it registers, because it's very, I mean, yeah, once you then get the emotional reaction of the other one, that's when you know that you've touched something, right? That they would prefer not to be touched, and that's probably where to go. Matthias, people who want to read more about your analysis and your insights, there's of course your books, but is there? You've said there's also a Substack. Where else should people find you?
Oh, yes, there is my book, which is translated now, I think, in 25 languages. So it's also in Japanese. It's and in Chinese and in most major languages. It's and there's my Substack page, where I publish short essays from time to time. Uh, Sometimes I don't publish anything for 2 or 3 months. Because I only write when I feel that there are certain things that want to be articulated. Otherwise, I don't write. Yeah. So my Substack page and my book is the two most important things, I think. I also publish from time to time something on the social media, but not too much because I think on Substack you can publish like these longer essays, which I prefer. So that's probably the most two important ways to learn about matter.
Okay. I will link to both, to your book as well as to your Substack, in the description box below. And then I hope to talk to you soon again in order to continue this conversation, and also the idea, the ways of getting out of the mess we've maneuvered ourselves into. Mattias Desmet, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Pascal.